She stepped off the coach into a town that had already decided who she was. Dry Willow baked under a pale sky, its single street lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired of standing. Clara Main carried one worn canvas bag and wore a black ribbon pinned at her throat. The ribbon told her story before she could. Widow. Alone. Unwelcome. The dust settled around her boots as the coach pulled away, leaving her exposed in the center of the street. Eyes found her immediately. A woman sweeping a porch stopped mid-stroke. Two men outside the general store went quiet. A child was pulled inside by her mother's firm hand. Clara felt the weight of their stares like stones pressed against her chest. She had known it would be this way. A woman traveling alone carried suspicion the way she carried that bag, something heavy, unavoidable, and impossible to set down. They would wonder where her family was, why she had no one, what she had done to end up here. The frontier had little mercy for women without men to vouch for them. Clara adjusted the ribbon at her throat and walked toward the nearest building. The sign above the door read, Dry Willow Mercantile. Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil and burlap. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on a narrow nose, looked up from his ledger. His expression shifted when he saw her, not hostile, but cautious. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. Her voice was steady, neither pleading nor proud. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. Whatever needs doing." The shopkeeper set down his pencil slowly. "Work's scarce, ma'am. Especially for—" He trailed off, his gaze flickering to the black ribbon. "For widows." Clara finished for him. He cleared his throat. "For anyone new to town. Folks here tend to keep business among those they know." She nodded once, thanked him, and left. The next door belonged to a boarding house. The woman who answered wore flour on her apron and suspicion in her eyes. She listened to Clara's request, glanced past her toward the street as if checking who might be watching, then shook her head. "Full up," she said, though Clara could see empty rooms through the doorway behind her. The saloon owner didn't bother with excuses. He simply said no. By the fourth refusal, Clara's feet ached and the sun had climbed high enough to burn through her bonnet. She stood in the thin shade of a cottonwood tree and let herself feel the exhaustion she'd been holding back since the coach ride. Since before that. Since the funeral. Since the creditors had taken the house. Since she'd realized that widowhood had stripped her of more than a husband, it had stripped her of a place in the world. But she did not cry. She had learned that tears changed nothing. A rancher passed on horseback, his hat pulled low. He glanced at her briefly, then away. Clara straightened her spine and smoothed her skirt. The dust on the hem would not brush off easily. Neither would the stairs. But she had not traveled 200 miles to turn back because a town looked at her sideways. Someone in Dry Willow needed help. Someone always did. And Clara Main had survived worse than cold shoulders and closed doors. She picked up her bag and walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land and the valley stretched wide and empty. If the town would not have her, perhaps the land would. The road out of Dry Willow narrowed to a wagon track that cut through scrub grass and scattered sage. Clara walked it slowly, her bag growing heavier with each step. The valley spread before her in shades of brown and gold, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods that marked a creek bed. In the distance, she could see fences, some standing, some sagging into the earth. She had been widowed 8 months. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man but not a wealthy one. He'd worked a small farm in Kansas, breaking soil that barely yielded enough to keep them fed. When fever took him in the spring, it took their future with him. The bank had waited a respectful 30 days before arriving with papers. Clara had left with the clothes she wore and the few dollars she'd hidden in a flour tin. She had no family to return to. Her mother was dead. Her father had remarried and made it clear his new wife had no room for a grown daughter. Her brother had gone west years ago and never written back. There were no aunts with spare bedrooms, no cousins offering charity. The world had narrowed to a simple truth: she needed work, or she would starve. The frontier promised opportunity, but it delivered mostly hardship. Women alone were suspected of moral failings. A widow without means was either pitted as helpless or judged as dangerous. A woman who might steal a husband, corrupt a household, or simply fail to survive and become the town's burden. Clara had seen it before. She would not beg. She would not become someone's charity case. She would work. A fence post came into view, leaning at an angle. Beyond it, a gate hung crooked on its hinges. A weathered sign nailed to the post read Holt Ranch in faded letters. Clara stopped and studied what lay beyond. The ranch house was low and functional, built from rough timber and necessity rather than pride. The roof showed patches where repairs had been made unevenly. A barn stood to one side, its doors slightly ajar. Corrals held fewer cattle than they should, and the pens looked half empty. Everything about the place whispered the same word: struggle. But smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. Clara adjusted her grip on her bag and walked through the gate. Her boots crunched on the dry earth. A dog barked once from somewhere behind the house, then went quiet. She was halfway to the porch when the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hands that showed the kind of wear that came from years of hard labor. He wore a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a hat that had seen better days. His face was weathered, his jaw set in a way that suggested he didn't smile often. He looked at Clara without expression, waiting for her to speak first. "I'm looking for work," Clara said, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "I can cook, clean, and mend. I'm steady and I won't quit." The man studied her for a long moment. His gaze took in the black ribbon, the worn dress, the single bag. He seemed to be weighing something, not her worth, but whether he could afford to care. "Name's Ethan Holt," he said finally. His voice was rough from disuse. "I don't have much to pay." "I don't need much," Clara replied. "Just fair wages and a place to sleep." Ethan looked past her toward the road, then back at her face. "The kitchen's a mess. Supplies are short. Work's hard. I'm not afraid of hard work." He nodded slowly, as if the decision had already been made before she arrived. "You can start now." The kitchen was worse than Clara had expected. The stove was crusted with grease and ash, the floor hadn't been swept in weeks, and the shelves held only the barest essentials: half a sack of flour, some beans, a little salt, and a tin of lard that looked as old as the ranch itself. A single pot hung from a hook, dented and blackened. The window above the basin was so dusty it barely let in light. Ethan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "My wife handled the cooking," he said, his voice flat. "That was 2 winters ago. Since then, it's been me and whatever I can manage. The hands bring their own food when they come, which isn't often anymore." Clara set her bag down and rolled up her sleeves. She didn't ask what had happened to his wife. The silence in his voice told her enough. Death had visited this house the same way it had visited hers, sudden, final, and without mercy. "I'll need water," she said. Ethan pointed toward the door. "Pump's out back. Creek runs about 100 yards past the barn if the pump gives out. Firewood stacked on the south side." He left without another word. Clara worked through the afternoon with the kind of focus that kept grief at bay. She hauled water in a bucket that leaked from a crack in the bottom, so she had to move quickly before it emptied. She scrubbed the stove until her knuckles bled, scoured the pot until it shone dully in the fading light, and swept the floor twice to get the dirt up. The shelves she wiped clean, then stared at the meager supplies and began calculating what could be stretched into a meal. Beans. Always beans. She soaked them in the pot with water and a pinch of salt, then set them on the stove to simmer. The flour she measured carefully, enough for biscuits, but only small ones. The lard went into a skillet she found buried under a pile of rags. It wasn't much, but it would feed working men if she was careful. By the time the sun dropped below the hills, the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and cooking food. Clara's back ached and her hands were raw, but the room looked like a place where people could eat without shame. Ethan returned as darkness settled. He was followed by 2 ranch hands, lean, weathered men who looked surprised to see a woman standing at the stove. They removed their hats and nodded to her cautiously, as if unsure whether she was real or some kind of tired hallucination. "This is Clara Maine," Ethan said. "She'll be cooking from now on." The men introduced themselves as Roy and Sam. They sat at the rough-hewn table without speaking much, their exhaustion written in every movement. Clara served the beans and biscuits on tin plates, then poured weak coffee into chipped mugs. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't even close. But it was hot and it was clean and it was more than they'd had in a long time. Roy took a bite and glanced at Sam. Sam ate slowly, then looked up at Clara. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "this is good." She nodded her thanks but didn't smile. Compliments were kind, but they didn't pay debts or fix fences. Ethan ate without looking up, his jaw working methodically. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and stood. "You'll sleep in the room off the kitchen," he told Clara. "It's small, but it's dry. Work starts at dawn." "I'll be ready," Clara said. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something more. Instead, he pulled his hat lower and walked out into the night. Clara cleared the plates and began planning tomorrow's meal with what little remained. Dawn came cold and gray. Clara woke to the sound of boots on the porch and the low voices of men preparing for work. She dressed quickly in the dim light of her small room, barely more than a closet with a cot and a single shelf, and stepped into the kitchen while stars still showed through the window. The fire had died overnight. She rebuilt it with kindling and patience, coaxing flame from ember until the stove began to warm. Water from the pump. Coffee ground stretched with chicory root she'd found in a jar. Cornmeal mush cooked thick and served with a drizzle of the precious lard. It wasn't much, but it would keep men working through the morning. Ethan appeared as the coffee began to boil. He nodded once to her and poured himself a cup, drinking it black and too hot. Roy and Sam followed shortly after, their faces still creased from sleep. They ate quickly and left without lingering. Clara noticed how they moved, not with energy, but with the grim determination of men who knew the work would never be finished. After they left, she surveyed the ranch with clear eyes. The place was failing. Not from laziness, but from something worse, inevitability. The herd was too small to turn a profit. The fences needed repair but there was no money for lumber. The barn roof had gaps that would let in winter snow. Everything required attention, but there were only 3 men and not enough hours in the day. Clara had seen farms die this way in Kansas. Slowly at first, then all at once. She spent the morning washing clothes in a tub outside, her hands turning red in the cold water. The men's shirts were torn at the shoulders and frayed at the cuffs. She mended what she could with thread she found in a tin, her stitches small and tight. Waste was a luxury no one here could afford. At midday, she walked to the barn with a pail of water and leftover cornmeal for the men. They were working on a section of fence that had collapsed, resetting posts in hard ground. Ethan swung a post-hole digger with mechanical precision, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cool air. Roy and Sam worked beside him, prying rocks from the earth and hauling rails into place. They stopped when they saw her. Sam took the water gratefully and drank long. Roy wiped his mouth and nodded his thanks. Ethan drank last, his eyes on the fence line rather than her face. "Looks like good work," Clara said. "It's a patch," Ethan replied. "The whole north section needs replacing, but we don't have the posts." She glanced at the sagging wire, the weathered wood. "How much do you need?" More than I can pay for. Clara didn't press. She understood debt the way she understood hunger, intimately and without illusion. She returned to the house and began preparing the evening meal. Beans again, but this time she added wild onions she'd found growing near the creek and a rabbit Roy had left hanging by the door. The meat was tough, but she stewed it slowly until it softened, and the smell that filled the kitchen was enough to make the house feel almost alive. That evening, the men ate with something closer to appetite than duty. Roy scraped his plate clean. Sam asked for seconds. Ethan ate in his usual silence, but when Clara refilled his coffee, he looked up and met her eyes for the first time. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "I've had practice," Clara replied. He nodded slowly, as if understanding what she meant. Survival taught skills that comfort never could. After the men left, Clara stood at the window and looked out at the dark valley. The ranch was struggling, but it was still standing. That was something. In a hard country, sometimes standing was enough. The days settled into rhythm. Clara rose before light, built the fire, and made coffee strong enough to wake dead men. She learned to stretch supplies the way her mother had during lean years. A handful of flour could become gravy, bean water could flavor broth, stale biscuits could be softened and fried. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. The ranch began to show small changes. The kitchen stayed clean. Clothes were mended before they tore beyond repair. The meals arrived on time and were hot. The men stopped looking surprised to find her there each morning. Roy was the first to warm to her. He was older than the others, with gray streaking his beard and a limp from an old injury. He began leaving things for her, a basket of wild greens, a string of fish from the creek, once a handful of sage that smelled clean when burned. He didn't ask for thanks and she didn't offer them. It was simply how things were done between people who understood work. Sam was quieter, more careful. He watched Clara the way a man watches a campfire in the wind, alert for signs it might go out. But he stopped removing his hat quite so quickly when she entered the room, and he began saying good morning without prompting. Small gestures, but they mattered. Ethan remained distant, though not unkind. He spoke only when necessary, his words chosen with the economy of a man who'd learned that talking changed little. But Clara noticed things. The way he made sure there was always firewood stacked near the kitchen door. How he fixed the leak in her water bucket without being asked. In the evening he brought her a heavier coat from somewhere in the house because the nights were turning cold. He never mentioned his wife, but her presence lingered in the house like smoke. A shawl still hung on a peg by the door. A cup with painted flowers sat unused on a high shelf. The room where Clara now slept had once held sewing supplies and dried herbs, evidence of a woman who'd built a life here before death took it away. Clara understood. She had left Thomas's razor on the shelf for 3 months after he died, unable to move it, unable to look at it. Grief had no timeline. It simply existed, like the weather. One evening after supper, Ethan stayed at the table while Roy and Sam headed to the bunkhouse. Clara poured him more coffee and sat across from him, too tired to stand any longer. Her hands ached from scrubbing pots, and her shoulders burned from hauling water. They sat in silence for a long time. The lamp between them flickered, casting uneven shadows on the walls. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said finally. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "The work's hard and the pay's barely worth calling pay. If you wanted to move on, I wouldn't hold it against you." Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me to leave?" "No." He stared into his coffee. "Just saying you could. Most people would. I'm not most people." He glanced up at her then, and something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. "No," he agreed. "You're not." Another silence stretched between them, but this one felt different. Less empty. More like understanding. "My husband died of fever," Clara said quietly. 8 months ago. We had a farm in Kansas, but it wasn't enough to keep once he was gone. The bank took it. Ethan nodded slowly. My wife died in childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. That was 2 winters back. The words hung in the air between them, not offered for pity, but as a simple fact. Loss was something they both carried, and speaking it aloud didn't make it lighter. But it made it less lonely. This ranch is all I've got left, Ethan said. Clara met his eyes across the table. Then we'll keep it standing. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, riding a fine horse and wearing a smile that didn't reach its eyes. Caleb Vaughn was a thick-built man with silver in his beard and hands that had grown soft from counting other people's money. He owned the largest ranch in the county, 3,000 acres of grazing land, a herd that numbered in the hundreds, and enough hired men to make sure everyone knew his name. He also held the note on Holt Ranch, purchased from the bank 2 years earlier when Ethan had needed cash to survive the winter after his wife died. Clara was hanging laundry when Vaughn rode up. She saw him pass the gate, his gaze sweeping over the property with the casual assessment of a man inventorying what would soon be his. He dismounted at the porch and didn't bother tying his horse, confident it wouldn't wander, confident nothing here would dare disobey him. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. His expression didn't change, but Clara saw his shoulders tighten. Holt, Vaughn said, his voice carrying across the yard. Missed you in town yesterday. Payment was due. I know when it's due, Ethan replied evenly. I'll have it by the end of the week. Vaughn tilted his head, his smile widening slightly. That's what you said last month. And the month before that. He glanced around the property again, his gaze lingering on the patched roof, the sagging fence, the half-empty corrals. This place is bleeding out, Ethan. You know it. I know it. Why prolong the suffering? Because it's mine. For now. Vaughn's eyes drifted past Ethan and settled on Clara. He studied her with open curiosity, taking in the black ribbon at her throat, the way she stood perfectly still with the wet shirt clutched in her hands. I heard you'd hired help. Didn't realize it was a woman. She cooks, Ethan said flatly. I'm sure she does. Vaughn's tone carried something that made Clara's stomach tighten. Not a direct insult, but the promise of one. A widow, I'm told. Come a long way to end up at a dying ranch. Clara met his gaze without flinching. I go where the work is. Of course you do. Vaughn turned back to Ethan. End of week, Holt. Or we'll be having a different conversation. He mounted his horse with practiced ease and rode off without waiting for a reply. Clara watched him go, noting the direction he took, not back toward town, but along the ridge where he could survey the valley and everything in it. Ethan stood motionless until Vaughn disappeared from sight. Then he turned and walked toward the barn without a word. Clara finished hanging the laundry, her hands moving automatically while her mind worked through what she'd just witnessed. That evening at supper, Roy and Sam ate quietly, their usual small talk absent. They'd seen Vaughn ride in. Everyone knew what his visits meant. After the men left, Clara began washing dishes. Ethan lingered at the table, staring at nothing. How much do you owe him? Clara asked. More than I can pay. Ethan's voice was tired. I borrowed to get through the winter after Sarah died. Vaughn bought the note from the bank and added his own interest. Now the number keeps growing no matter how much I pay. That's not legal. It's legal enough when you own the judge. Ethan rubbed his face. He wants this land. Always has. It sits between his property and the creek. With this ranch, he'd control all the water in the valley. Clara dried her hands slowly. What happens if you can't pay? He takes it all. The land, the herd, everything. Ethan looked up at her. You should leave before that happens. When this place goes under, it'll pull everyone down with it. Clara hung the towel on its hook and turned to face him. I told you once already. I won't quit. The poison worked slowly, spreading through Dry Willow like water soaking into dry ground. It started with whispers. Clara heard them when she went to town for supplies, conversations that stopped when she approached, eyes that followed her down the street. The shopkeeper who'd turned her away weeks earlier now looked at her with something beyond caution. Something closer to contempt. At the mercantile, the prices had changed. Flour that cost 30 cents the week before now cost 50. When Clara questioned it, the clerk shrugged and said prices fluctuated. She paid and left, her small coin purse lighter than it should have been. The church was worse. Clara had attended Sunday service twice, sitting in the back and speaking to no one. The third Sunday, when she took her usual seat, the woman beside her gathered her skirts and moved to a different pew. Another family followed. By the time the service began, Clara sat alone in a circle of empty benches, as visible as if she'd been placed on display. She didn't return the following week. Roy brought the rumors back to the ranch like burrs stuck to his coat. "They're saying things in town," he told Clara one morning, his voice low and apologetic. "About you. Where you came from. Why are you here? What kind of things?" Clara asked, though she already knew. Roy looked uncomfortable. "That you weren't really married. That you drifted from place to place, sharing beds for food and shelter. That you bring bad luck to any place that takes you in." He met her eyes. "It's horseshit, ma'am. Everyone here knows it. But people in town are listening." Clara's hand stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. "Who's spreading it?" "Vaughn's men. They drink at the saloon and talk loud enough for everyone to hear. Some folks don't believe it, but others." He trailed off. Others wanted to believe it. It was easier than questioning a powerful man. The consequences came quickly. The mercantile refused to extend credit. The feed store claimed they were out of stock on items Clara could see sitting on the shelves behind the counter. When Sam went to town to buy lamp oil, he was told the ranch's account had been closed due to concerns about repayment. Ethan rode into Dry Willow the next day and came back with his jaw clenched and his hands tight on the reins. He tried to speak with the banker, the feed store owner, the mercantile clerk. All of them had given him the same message, delivered with apologetic shrugs and averted eyes. Caleb Vaughn had made it known that anyone who did business with Holt Ranch would lose his patronage. In a town where Vaughn controlled half the commerce, that was a threat no one could afford to ignore. "They're choking us out," Roy said that evening, his voice bitter. "Can't pay the debt if we can't buy supplies. Can't work the ranch if we can't feed ourselves. Vaughn doesn't need to foreclose. He just needs to wait until we starve." Clara listened in silence, her mind working through the strategy. It was clever, she had to admit. Vaughn hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply used his influence the way water used gravity, following the path of least resistance and eroding everything in its way. Sam looked at Ethan. "What are we going to do?" Ethan stared at the table, his expression unreadable. Clara could see him calculating, weighing options that all led to the same conclusion. Without supplies, the ranch would fail. Without credit, they couldn't buy supplies. Without Vaughn's goodwill, they couldn't get credit. It was a noose that tightened with every breath. "We are going to the town meeting Saturday," Clara said quietly. All three men looked at her. "And say what?" Ethan asked. Clara met his eyes. "The truth." Saturday came with clear skies and a wind that carried dust through the streets of Dry Willow. The town meeting was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. Clara walked through the doors with her head high and the black ribbon still pinned at her throat. Ethan walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Together. The room fell silent when they entered. Faces turned. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. A few looked openly hostile. Caleb Vaughn sat in the front row, his legs crossed and his expression relaxed. He'd already won, and he knew it. The meeting began with the usual business: road repairs, water rights, a dispute over fence lines. Clara waited, her hands folded in her lap, her heart steady. When the moderator asked if there was any new business, she stood. "I'd like to speak," she said. The moderator hesitated, glancing toward Vaughn. Then he nodded. "Go ahead, Mrs. Main." Clara stepped into the aisle so everyone could see her. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. "My name is Clara Main. Some of you have heard stories about me, that I'm a drifter, that I wasn't properly married, that I bring misfortune wherever I go." She paused, letting the words settle. "Those stories are lies." A murmur rippled through the room. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Clara continued. "I was married to Thomas Main for 6 years. We farmed in Kansas until he died of fever last spring. The bank took our land. I came here because I had nowhere else to go and because I'm willing to work. That's the truth. Not exciting. Not scandalous. Just a widow trying to survive." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. The people spreading these lies know they're false. They're doing it because Holt Ranch stands between Caleb Vaughn and the land he wants. If you destroy my reputation, you destroy the ranch's ability to do business. If the ranch can't do business, it fails. If it fails, Mr. Vaughn gets what he wants without having to pay a fair price for it. "That's a serious accusation," Vaughn said, his voice calm. He didn't stand. "Can you prove any of this?" Ethan rose from his seat. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. "This is the original loan agreement. Borrowed amount, $300. Interest rate, 8% annually." He unfolded a second paper. "This is the payment schedule Vaughn gave me 6 months ago. Same loan, but now the amount owed is $700, and the interest is 14%. When I asked about the discrepancy, I was told the terms had been renegotiated to account for late payments. I was never late." The murmur grew louder. People shifted in their seats. "I also have statements from the mercantile and feed store," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "Both increased prices on goods sold to the ranch by 40% in the same week Vaughn started spreading rumors about Clara. Both dropped prices back to normal for everyone else." Vaughn stood slowly. His smile was gone. "This is a waste of everyone's time. Holt owes money he can't pay. Everything else is desperation and noise." "Then show your ledger," Clara said. "Put your accounting next to his. Let the town decide who's telling the truth." Vaughn's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked less certain. The room had gone quiet, waiting. The moderator cleared his throat. "Mr. Vaughn, do you have documentation to share?" Vaughn looked around the room, at the faces watching him, weighing him, doubting him for the first time. He smiled thinly. "I don't answer to mobs," he said. Then he walked out. The room exhaled. Not quite a belief. Not quite vindication. But doubt had been planted, and doubt was enough to crack a reputation built on fear. That night, the south barn burned. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of animals screaming. She ran outside in her nightdress, barefoot on the cold ground. Flames climbed the barn walls, bright orange against the black sky. Ethan was already there, shouting orders. Roy and Sam stumbled from the bunkhouse, still pulling on their boots. Ethan didn't run into the fire. He grabbed an axe and began cutting the corral fence, driving the panicked horses and cattle away from the flames. Sam helped, wielding a rope to guide the animals toward the creek. Roy hauled buckets of water, not to fight the fire, which was already too large, but to wet down the house and keep the sparks from spreading. Clara joined him, her hands blistering on the bucket handles, her lungs burning with smoke. The heat was immense, driving them back again and again. Ethan worked with grim efficiency, not trying to save what was already lost but protecting what could still survive. He used a saw to drop a section of fence, creating a firebreak between the barn and the house. When the flames reached the gap, they faltered, finding nothing to feed on. The barn collapsed inward with a roar of sparks and timber, but the house stood. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out. The barn was gone, nothing left but charred posts and ash. The animals had scattered across the valley, but most had survived. Clara and Ethan sat on the porch steps, blackened with soot, shaking with exhaustion. Her hands were raw and bleeding. His face was burned along one side. Roy pointed toward the ridge. Saw riders up there before sunrise. 3 of them. Watched the fire, then left. No one spoke. They all knew who had sent them. The town knew too. By mid-morning, neighbors began arriving, not with words, but with lumber, tools, and strong backs. They'd seen the fire from miles away. They'd watched who stayed and who ran. Some came because they believed Clara. Others came because they didn't like being played for fools by a rich man who thought he owned their choices. They rebuilt through the fall. The barn rose smaller than before, but solid. The debt was renegotiated, not with Vaughn, who sold his holdings and left the county by winter, but with a bank in the next town over, at terms Ethan could meet. In the spring, Ethan asked Clara to stay. Not as a cook. As a partner. She agreed because the work was honest and the home had been earned through fire and effort and truth. They married quietly. The ranch stood scarred but whole. Clara's hands still worked the stove each morning, but her name was on the deed beside his. In Dry Willow, she was no longer a widow passing through. She was home. If you enjoyed Clara's story of courage and resilience, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the Wild West. Share this video with someone who loves stories of grit and survival. Thanks for listening.